Welcome back to News and Views, 8:46 Central African Time. We are heading to the second hour of the show, and we've spoken about unemployment. We've spoken about the pressure on household electricity bills, and now we're going to be turning our attention to something that cuts across almost every part of South African life: corruption and accountability. The country has spent years investigating allegations of corruption, and they stem across the spectrum, whether it's from local government to the highest levels of the state. And I think the ongoing Matlanga Commission has once again put some of those concerns into very, very sharp focus, exposing allegations that point to serious weaknesses within parts of the state and our criminal justice system. But I think the issue goes much deeper than just one commission. Why does South Africa continue to struggle to prevent corruption and investigate it effectively? And I think most importantly, and I think what most of us as South Africans want to see, ensuring that there are consequences when wrongdoing is uncovered and is, we all like saying, seeing people in orange overalls. That doesn't happen as much as we'd like it to. And joining us now is Lawson Naidoo of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. He's going to be helping us unpack where South Africa's corruption fight is failing. Lawson, good morning. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate your time.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me on.
Pleasure is all ours. I want to start this conversation a bit broadly, from your vantage point. Why or why does corruption remain so, deeply entrenched in South Africa, despite the number of laws and institutions that are essentially designed to fight it? I mean, when you look at the laws that we have and, some of the state organs that are in place, it would feel like it shouldn't be a problem at all in a country like ours, but it's top of the headlines every morning.
Yeah, as you say, we have the legislative tools, and to some extent, we have the institutional architecture in order to combat corruption. But those tools are not being effectively used, and we see extensive accountability gaps within those institutional mechanisms that we do have, and we'll come to that in a moment. But I think, for example, what the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry now exposes to us is the failure of those accountability mechanisms and how people operate outside of those mechanisms in order to pursue narrow personal interests. In the case of the Madlanga Commission, looking at the impact of organized criminal cartels on um, on our society, the way that law enforcement agencies have been subverted by those cartels in order not to be held accountable. So I think that gives us a sort of overall picture of why we have failed. And we look at the institutional mechanisms that we've had since the dawn of democracy almost. If we go back to the 2000s, and we had the Scorpions as the main anti-corruption entity, was largely successful because it combined the investigations and the prosecutors in a prosecution led strategy to counter corruption. That was then disbanded and replaced by the Hawks. And the Hawks were located within the South African Police Service and therefore subject to the hierarchy and the control mechanisms of a police service, and therefore not sufficiently independent, in my view. That's now been replaced by the IDAC. And again, your viewers will be aware of the allegations that have come forth at the Madlanga Commission to demonstrate how, in certain cases, the independent directorate has also been subverted. But having said all of that, we should not lose track of the fact that the IDAC has scored many successes, and the NPA, the National
Mm.
Prosecuting Authority, and particularly through its asset forfeiture unit, has scored many successes in terms of being able to recoup some of the monies that have been stolen from the public purse. Just as an example, we have a former Minister of Defense and a former Speaker of the National Assembly, Mampisa Nkakula, who is currently on trial for corruption. That doesn't happen in many countries, and therefore,
Mm.
we must take pride in the fact that when they put their minds to it, these entities can do what is expected of them, but they don't do it on a regular and sufficiently constant basis.
And I think that's very, very important to note some of those successes, which sometimes, or even most times, feel like they're overshadowed by some of these revelations that we see coming out from the various commissions. And I want to start with that. We have major revelations. I mentioned this in my intro that corruption and the revelations dominate headlines almost every morning. There's a new story that is being revealed to South Africans. Investigations over the years reveal some new, I think, aspect of a country that the public didn't know much about. We seem to have gotten that right. The fact that we able to have these commissions that reveal and show us just how deeply entrenched corruption is in the country, but it fails to translate to accountability. Very rarely you would see people getting arrested. I think you can count three or four really major headline arrests and accountability measures that have been put in place, but the revelations are quite staggering. What do you think there's this mismatch between holding people accountable and just how much has been revealed over the years when it comes to corruption?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think the Zondo Commission was a very useful exercise in that it exposed, large-scale corruption across government entities, as you say, from national government through to state-owned companies down to the local municipal level. And where we've probably failed as a country is in that follow through in terms of ensuring that those people are those people who were implicated are properly investigated, and where sufficient evidence exists that they are in fact prosecuted. Now that isn't happening to the extent that we would all like to see it, as you've explained. But there are institutional barriers to that, and I think we've got to take a really broad, holistic look at where we are as a country. If we just take IDAC as an example, it's only been in place as a permanent entity for 2 years, even though it was a strong recommendation from the Zondo Commission that we needed a dedicated anti-corruption agency. But it doesn't have the capacity nor the resources to do what we expect it to do. We've seen the issue of the leadership crisis there, the damning allegations against Andrea Johnson, the former head of IDAC, and some of those around her. And the question has to be asked, are the appointment procedures that lead to these people being appointed to these senior positions, are they fit for purpose? And the answer has got to be no. And it's not just within IDAC that question arises. It arises within the South African Police Service itself and across the law enforcement agencies, where it's executive decision making, often by the president, who makes those decisions. And they prove time and again to be poor decisions. I mean, we've got to ask ourselves, what sort of system do we have in place that could allow someone like a Ria Peeja to become the commissioner of the South African Police Service without any policing experience whatsoever? And nothing has changed in that regard. The Zondo Commission made recommendations about how these appointment processes, as an example, could be strengthened. We still haven't done anything about that, and yet we look surprised when we don't have the capacity. So appointment processes are one thing. Strengthening the institutions themselves, including ensuring that they have greater independence. The IDEC, for example, is located within the NPA, but the NPA is not fully and truly independent. It relies for its budget and many operational decisions on the Department of Justice or the Minister of Justice. That is not an ideal situation and doesn't give us a sense of true independence. So there are lots of recommendations that various civil society organizations like CASAC have made over the years to government to say, this is what we need to do to strengthen these institutions. And yet government has been slow to do that. We get the rhetoric that they're committed to fighting corruption, but the political will at the end of the day doesn't really appear to be there.
I want to touch on the point that you made about the independence of some of these institutions, institutions such as the NPA, the Hawks. I think you can even count the Public Protector and even the Auditor General. These institutions, are they sufficiently independent, as you alluded to, and empowered to do their jobs? And if not, could it be the reason why we find ourselves where we do?
I think largely that's correct. I mean, I think I would make an exception, perhaps for the Auditor General, because they largely self-funded, because they charge state-owned entities and government departments for the audit services that they provide. There's a separate issue there about whether they always get paid promptly for the
Mm,
work that they do. But the Auditor General's office, I think, has been one of the shining stars in our constitutional firmament that has consistently produced over 30 odd years very good results in terms of exposing malfeasance within the public sector. Whether those reports are acted upon is, of course, now another matter. The public protector would argue, for example, that they don't have sufficient resources, that they don't have sufficient investigative capacity to do justice to all of the complaints that they receive. And I think the same could be said for the NPA and IDAC.
mm,
They need, for example, speaking specifically of the NPA and IDAC, they need dedicated high level capacity, forensic skills, and the like, which they don't have in sufficient numbers. They don't have, the IDAC hasn't yet had full access to the Zondo database of all of the information that was gathered through the 5 or more years of the Zondo Commission. They
mm,
don't have unfettered access there. They have to go through the Department of Justice. And these obstacles ultimately impact on the effectiveness of these institutions. And we've got to remove these bottlenecks. They're not difficult to do. And if we're really serious about fighting corruption, then the resources have to be made available. There were
mm,
lots of complaints that the Zondo Commission cost so much money, around R1 billion. It was a waste of time. But just in terms of the asset forfeiture aspect, they've recouped 9 or 10 billion rand based on information that emanated at the commission. So
mm,
it's well worth, that was money well spent, R1 billion well spent. And similarly, if we allocate those resources to anti-corruption agencies, we will see the results, not just in recouping the monies that are stolen, but also, as you say, ultimately seeing people in orange overalls.
mm, mm. I want to circle back to the Madlanga Commission because it's dominating the headlines right now, and it's currently exposing some very, very serious allegations about the functioning of parts of the state, very, very important parts of the state. Without focusing, I think, specifically on the commission itself, what does this tell us about some of the vulnerabilities within our state institutions, and just how damaging is it when looking at IDAC, for instance, when allegations of corruption involve the very same institutions that are supposed to investigate and prevent corruption to be taking place in the first place?
Well, I think this is where we've got to focus on the accountability mechanisms and institutions. So we have a range of these entities that we've discussed across the criminal justice sector, if you like, from the South African Police Service, then to the agencies within that, such as the Hawks and Crime Intelligence. Then we have the NPA and the IDAC, the Special Investigating Unit, and so on. And where we see failures or lack of accountability within those institutions, the question needs to be asked: who is supposed to be overseeing the effective functioning of those institutions to make sure that they actually do what the law and the Constitution requires of them? And ultimately, that question falls back on Parliament and the institutions of Parliament. And again, this is something that the Zondo Commission made very, very clear in its report, where it said if Parliament had been alive to what was happening, in particular in SOEs, ESCOM, Transnet, PRASA, and the like, we wouldn't have had the state capture that we had. But Parliament was asleep at the wheel. The committees were not paying sufficient attention to the reports that we're getting that were highlighting these issues. They turned a blind eye, and they continue to do so today. So we rather than just looking at these institutions themselves, as I've highlighted some of the potential fixes for those institutions, those in
Mm,
themselves will not guarantee results unless the whole system works together and the oversight is there. To take the independent directorate as an example, IDAC, if people like who've been testifying over the last few days, Drushanta Ramsamy,
Mm-hmm.
If the office of the oversight ombud at IDAC had been in place from the start, when IDAC was established 2 years ago, people like her would have had somewhere to go to say, look, there are wrong things happening here. Can you please investigate? I can't go to my superiors because those are the ones that are implicated. That oversight judge, Judge Takalani Ralinga, was only appointed in March this year, long after all these shenanigans around crime intelligence had already happened. So when we
Mm.
don't put those oversight mechanisms in place, we can't then later complain that things went awry because we haven't done the things that we ought to have done.
Very, very important. And just maybe to slightly move away from the institutional conversations around the state and some of its organs, um, and trickle down to socially. There's a conversation that was being had on social media not so long ago about maybe South Africa just intrinsically being corrupt. It has become an issue of morality within society in itself. And when you have a society that feels and looks intrinsically corrupt, then you'll have corrupt people in state institutions, you'll have corrupt policemen, and so forth and so forth. How do you respond to that conversation that maybe socially there's some work that needs to be done also, so that it doesn't trickle down to state organs and state institutions?
Well, what is required, and we do have in place in South Africa a national anti-corruption strategy, which was
Hmm.
developed a few years ago, approved by cabinet, and as a result of which a national anti-corruption advisory council was established. That council reported to the president a year ago, and we've heard nothing out of the presidency since then in terms of what it's going to do in respect of implementing some of the recommendations. Now, without going into the detail of those recommendations, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy itself speaks of a whole of society approach to combating corruption. These institutions that we've been talking about cannot do that fight on their own. They need all of us to support them. They need
Mm,
us to bring to the attention of the authorities when we see wrongdoing. In order for that to be effective, we need proper whistleblower protection, which we currently don't have in South Africa. Again, an issue that has been highlighted for many years, but government again has been very slow to act in that regard. And then it comes down to you and I,
mm,
individuals in South Africa. When we get stopped by a traffic officer, we are willing to pay for that cool drink. That contributes to corruption. So we've got to
mm,
look at our own ethical and moral compasses and say this is a society we want to have, that we will not tolerate corruption. We will blow the whistle when we see or hear about it. And all of us need to put our shoulders to the wheel in this regard. So we don't feel as we do, and as reflected in those social media comments that you referred to, that there's a culture of impunity, that people can just get away with it. So it doesn't really matter if I contribute to corruption, because there are no consequences. We've got to break free from that cycle and create a society based on the values and principles that are enunciated in our constitution.
Very, very important to note. We are heading towards the local government elections later on in the year. How important will the conversation around corruption, especially how it relates to service delivery, and just general accountability, will be when voters decide who will govern their communities, especially at local government level, which is very, very important, and I think affects the day-to-day experiences of life for majority of us.
Yeah. Well, these local government elections, like all elections, are important. But these are very important. Um, this is where people, interact with government on the most regular basis in terms of our service delivery, be it refuse collection, lights, water, and the like. And again, we've seen examples of huge corruption at local government level. And voters have walked away in large numbers over the years. We see declining levels of participation in elections generally, and local government elections in particular. But again, it's up to each of us to say, we have the authority and the power to vote. Let us use those votes wisely. Let us really focus on who the candidates are, Are these people who have been there and have failed to deliver before? Who are the new candidates and what are they offering? Can we really trust them to deliver on what they're offering? So I think as a society, we need to be asking those questions. And when we go and cast our votes on the 4th of November, we do so in the hope that the people that we will elect will actually live up to what the constitutional and legal requirements are, that we have fit and proper people who have the interests of the community at heart and not the interests of political parties that put them there. Far too often, we've seen people more beholden to their political leaders than to the voters who actually put them into office.
Well, they have it, Lawson and Naidoo of Kasak. Thank you so much for joining us and for breaking
Thank
down, I
you.
think, a very, very important conversation. Really appreciate it. And with that, we're going to take a quick break. News and views will continue after this.